As we move into late summer here in the Northern Hemisphere and tomato harvests ideally start accumulating, a lot of gardeners and homesteaders start making a lot of tomato sauce. I think that every gardener probably has their own unique approach to making sauce. I'm no exception, so today I thought I would just share my own approach to the whole thing. All right, before I get into the actual sauce making process, I'm going to go over real quick the tomatoes that I'm working with this summer, for making sauce and what makes them good or, less good choices for various sauces and other processed applications. So first, we have one of my favorite sauce and paste tomato varieties, the Rio Grande, and it is I would call it a Roma type plum tomato. It's very similar to the Roma. This one here is not a prime example. They get much bigger than this. I'd say 3.5 inches in length. My plants are just getting a little bit old at this point in the tomatoes that were left on the vines. The kind of the dregs of the season, so to speak, but still very usable as a sauce tomato. What I love about these, in addition to the fact that they're way less blossom end rot prone than other Roma types that I've tried, and they seem to be just very suited to the hot and dry summers of Sacramento, is for one thing, you can see that it's a very simple seed cavity. If you want a tomato for something like a salsa or just to jar up, quartered or diced tomatoes, something where you're going to have to peel and core the tomato, this is what you're going to want because this is very easy to de-seed. It's usually like a one-shot thing, as you can see here. Boom, seeds are out. It's like, I would say, 2 seed chambers in there and you're done. Also, it is a very dry tomato, so it stores for a very long time, thick skin, dry. I've had periods of time where I just wasn't, very busy and couldn't get to making sauce or processing for a while. And, these will keep, even after fully ripe, for a week or two on the shelf. So highly recommend these. Perhaps the one downside of them is because they're so dry, it can be difficult to run them through my tomato strainer without some kind of freezing or cooking first. So that's maybe a very minor downside if you're making primarily puree-based sauces. But if you mix them in with other wetter tomatoes, they go right through. So up next is a new to me sauce variety this summer, the Canestrino De Luca. Admittedly, a big part of the motivation for this video was I just wanted an excuse to show off how huge these are. These are the biggest sauce or paste variety tomato that I've ever grown. Really impressed with these this year. So these are higher moisture, thinner skin, higher moisture content than one of the Roma types, again, like the Rio Grande here, which makes it great for running through a tomato strainer for puree type tomato sauces. Cut this open here so everybody can see. Probably easier to do it this way. Oh, quick tip, if you're new to tomatoes, a serrated knife is way easier than a straight edge knife to cut tomatoes. So you can see here, the seed cavity is a lot more complex. I've done it. I have, peeled and got the seeds out, and it's a tedious process, extra tedious. Peeling and coring is just a tedious thing in and of itself. But these are just very meaty tomatoes. The amount of pulp, you could almost not reduce it much and make a tomato soup. That's how much pulp to juice ratio there is. And because, like you can see, it's very moist, the pieces run right through the press super easily. So I'm loving this so far this season, and definitely this is going to be more or less in the permanent rotation in my garden. All right, and finally, we have everything else. I grow a lot of tomatoes, a lot of slicers and cherries. They just don't have a very long shelf life, so we can only eat so many of these, raw. And fresh off the vine. So a lot of these, I just end up running them right through my tomato strainer. And you can make tomato sauce out of any tomato. The downside of things like slicers, like this Super Sue, or even these cherries, all very high moisture content. So what you strain out of them is very kind of watery. That's not a huge deal. It just means extra cooking time. You know, it takes a little longer to evaporate off the water and thicken the sauce. The other thing to watch out for sometimes with small cherries, running them through a strainer, is the seeds can be small enough to make it through the strainer. And again, if there's a few of seeds, you know, it's not a huge deal, but there's just something to look out for. All right, so those are my tomato that I'm working with for sauce this summer. Let's get into the actual sauce making process. Quick piece of advice before I get to the actual sauce making though. You're probably going to run into situations, especially early season, where either you know, maybe you have a handful of tomatoes that are ready and ripe, but it's not really enough to bust out all of the sauce making and canning stuff. Or maybe you have a bunch of tomatoes that you picked, say, on a Monday. The work week is rough. The tomatoes are starting to get a little close to overripe, but you just don't have it in you to do a big sauce making operation, you know, after a hard work day or something. So you're going to have to find a way to preserve those tomatoes, you know, until you're ready to make a big batch of sauce. What I used to do was take whole tomatoes and try to bag them up in freezer bags, and then do my best to force the air out and freeze them that way. And the problem that I ran into was I could not avoid freezer burn. No matter how hard I tried to get the air out, you know, it got back in, and you know, I'd end up with some freezer burn tomatoes. That and whole tomatoes, they take up a ton of freezer space. So what I actually started doing was, in a freezer safe vessel, I've been chunking up my tomatoes, and then I will take something like a potato masher here and just cram them in as tight as I can. And I find that getting a layer of the juice on top like this, after that freezes up, that goes a long way to lock out freezer burn. You know, and I've been storing them now before making sauce for a couple of months. I don't know how well this would, not a couple of months, a couple of weeks rather. I don't know how well it would lock out freezer burn over, say, you know, 6 months. But for the short duration freezes that I need to do, it's been working fine. It saves a lot of room in the freezer as well. Quick word to the wise, if you go with a plastic container like this, dedicate it only to storing tomatoes or other things that don't have a strong scent, because the last thing you probably want is for your you know, tomato puree to be, you know, tasting and smelling a little bit like week old Chinese food. You know, plastic, unfortunately, it does pick up, you know, scent really sticks to it. Sometimes I will actually run, you know, the tomatoes through my strainer and just get a juice and pulp mixture and freeze that. But honestly, my strainer is kind of a pain to clean, so sometimes I'm burnt out and I don't feel like doing that. I find that this is really working for me so far this summer. Mash it into a container, freeze it, and then unthaw and run it through my strainer, you know, when I'm ready to make a big batch of sauce. All right, now it's time to run some tomatoes through my tomato strainer. The first thing, of course, is to just, before putting them in the hopper here, cut them into rough chunks. Things like cherry tomatoes or other small tomatoes can go through whole. When I use the mallet here, they mash right through the auger and strainer just fine on their own. I'm going to run, first I'm going to run, whoops, I got a stem in there, you don't want that, the cherry and slicer combination through the strainer first. And then I'm going to do my dedicated sauce tomatoes, the Canestrinos and the Rio Grandes, just to show how much thicker and pulpier the juice is when you stick to just sauced and paste tomatoes. I have a whole long review, well, not super long, I think it was like 8 minutes, on this particular tomato strainer that I posted last year. It goes into a little more detail on assembly and, you know, pros and cons, but in general, in spite of what I consider to be some design flaws, this has been a game changer when it comes to making homemade sauces. It saves a tremendous amount of time. Before going with this, before I got this, I would, if I wanted a seed-free sauce, which I just don't like the texture of tomato seeds, even when I've tried, you know, pureeing them all up into the same, you know, just running the, you know, cooking the seeds and then pureeing everything down. with like an immersion blender, I can still, just the texture of seeds, I hate it. So I really like a mostly seed-free sauce. So anyway, before I got this, what I had to do was peel and core every single tomato. And that is just beyond tedious. I hate that more than any other tomato processing task. So this is a tremendous time saver. And I realized as I did this, I completely forgot to put a bowl down to catch the scraps. So let me take care of that real quick. This is what happens when you go unscripted with this sort of thing. Take care of that later. But a note on the scraps, you don't want to just put that right into the compost. You can actually probably run that through another 2 or 3 times and milk a little more pureed sauce out of the whole thing. But back to the tomato strainer itself, this cost about $140. It is imperfect. It's probably not as good as one of the higher end electric strainers, but really worth it for the money. So I'm going to link the video review that I did on this when I initially got it at the end of this video, just in case anybody has been on the fence about getting one of these and wants a little more in-depth analysis, so to speak. All right, so one of the things that I don't like about this is I can't fit a very big catchment vessel under the spout here. So I have to empty this, fairly regularly. So I'm going to dump this into a pot. I'm going to cut, and then I'm going to run through the sauce tomatoes. All right, I have reloaded the hopper here with only dedicated paste or sauce tomatoes, the combination of Canestrinos and Rio Grandes. And I also adjusted my tripod, so hopefully there's not going to be quite as much shaking as I turn the crank on this thing. But what I really wanted to do was just demonstrate, and I'm not sure if it's going to come through. The lighting in my kitchen isn't, studio quality, by any measure. But hopefully it becomes apparent once the juice starts coming out here. And we get into the new stuff. Still got some residual cherry and slicing tomato juice coming out of there. How much thicker and pulpier it is when you stick to just the sauce tomatoes. There we go. Now we're into the new stuff. And it might not be noticeable, but it's way harder now to turn the crank on this. Forcing these through the hopper, or rather the auger, is much harder due to their lower moisture content. And yeah, you can see it's flowing down the spout a lot slower. It's a lot thicker. So what that means is if you do this officially the right way and stick only to sauce and paste tomatoes, your cook time is going to be a lot less. There's just a lot less water to simmer off. But I just can't let stuff go to waste. I put a lot of work into growing my tomatoes from start to finish, and the thought of just letting all of my sauce tomatoes and cherry tomatoes go bad because I, can't eat any more fresh is just all kinds of wrong. So I just put up with the longer cooking time. All right, once I'm through this, it's really just a matter of getting it on the stove for the next several hours. All right, I have everything on the stove now. I have one 20-quart pot completely full, and then I had a little too much, so I'm gonna simmer it down in a secondary pot here. This wasn't all strained today. I had a bank of strained juice and pulp already in the freezer. You can see the chunks of ice still there. There's really, this will take well into the evening at this point. It is a long, involved process, and you're going to be more or less babysitting simmering pots of juice on the stove all day. I can't say, it's my favorite thing in the world to do, but this is for it's a very limited season, when tomatoes are ready for processing, and it's definitely worth the effort. It's one of those things, cry now, enjoy later sort of a deal. So I'm going to let this stuff simmer, cook down a bit, and then we'll be back in a few hours. We're now about 2.5 or so hours into simmering this, and they've reduced down enough that I was able to combine both pots into one. What I'm going to do now is actually add some fresh vegetables to the mix. In here I have some peppers, some onions, fresh garlic, oregano, even a little zucchini and eggplant that I picked out of the garden here. I'm going to carefully, hopefully not burn myself adding this. And it goes, oh yeah, I'm splattering that everywhere. Super safe. So let's mix that in. Just a quick word to the wise about adding fresh vegetables like this. One, you want to go sparingly. This is supposed to still taste kind of like a marinara tomato sauce, not a mixed vegetable slop. So you don't really want to overdo it. Also, if you're going to be canning like I am, in order for a tomato product to be safely canned, it really needs to have a pH of 4.6 or lower. And adding too much fresh vegetables can raise that pH to an unsafe level, and botulism is no joke. I have a pH meter that I'm going to use to double check before I can to make sure it's at a safe pH. I really recommend not winging it like I do. Officially, I would recommend everybody only sticking to a USDA approved canning recipe. But I'm fairly comfortable, having done it in the past, just making sure my pH level is low enough before canning. Also, I would not yet add any salt or concentrated seasoning. This still has a long way to cook down before it's ready. And what you don't want to do is add too much salt now, and then as more water cooks off, that salt becomes unbearably concentrated. So wait to add the salt and other things like, if you want garlic powder, onion powder in it, the highly concentrated stuff, wait more toward the end after it's at the consistency you want. Also, I will be running my immersion blender through this to puree it up. I'm not going to be leaving these huge vegetable chunks in there. It's really just to add some complexity of flavor. But if you do want a chunkier texture, you would probably just want to dice everything up a lot smaller. All right, so now I'm going to leave it alone again for a few more hours. All right, the sauce has now been on the stove for, I don't know, a little over 4 hours, I think. And it's starting to thicken up significantly. So what that means is it's time to immersion blend to break up these big chunks of vegetables and make everything a nice, smooth, puree style sauce. All right, with all the veggies now blended in, hopefully nice and smooth, I put everything back on the burner, bringing it back up to temp, and I'm going to add some diced tomatoes that a little earlier, I think last week, I had peeled and cored and frozen a few quarts of diced tomatoes just to add a little extra texture. And oh yeah, gotta love that splatter. Doing this, filming with one hand and cooking with the other, probably isn't the best idea, but here we are. And in that one goes. All right, and back to cooking off some moisture. Now about 5 or 6 hours into the process, the sauce is finally reduced to a consistency I want, so I'm going to add some dry spices and seasonings. I've got salt, garlic powder, onion powder, and even a little cayenne. It's really important to add a little bit at a time and do taste tests. You can't take salt back, but you can add more if you need it. As far as salt, I really like to use pickling salt just because there are no additives like anti-caking agents or iodine, which I think can impart some off flavors to the mix. Before I start canning, I just want to check the pH here. I did calibrate my meter off camera before doing this, and it looks like we're good to go. It is well below the 4.6 threshold that you really want for canning. So I'm going to go ahead and get set up for that. And it's time to start filling jars. Even though you can, there are many water bath canning recipes for tomato products, I am actually going to go with pressure canning for this for 2 reasons. One, I save the step of having to pre-sterilize jars. Just a basic wash is good enough when you pressure can. And also it reduces the amount of processing time that I'm going to need. And at this point, I'm getting really sick of this project. So here you want to fill your jars up to the point where there's about 1 inch of head space, between the level of the sauce and the rim of the jar. Then you're going to use some vinegar on a clean cloth to wipe the rim of the jar to make sure there's nothing that can interfere with the seal of the lid. Then you're going to want to get your lid and band in place. When you tighten the band, get it so it's secure, but you don't want to tighten it so much that it takes a torque wrench to get the thing off. It's got to hold pressure, but it's also got to come back off. With the water preheated to about 180 degrees, I've put my 7 quarts in the canner. Then what I do is I let the steam vent out of the spout here for about 10 minutes. Then I place the canning weight gauge here and wait a little more. When the weight starts wobbling back and forth vigorously like this, I set a timer for 25 minutes, which is how much time we want to process. And once the 25 minutes is up, we're just going to cut the heat and walk away. We want to let this whole setup cool and depressurize gradually on its own. And about an hour later, it's time for the moment of truth. Hopefully the lids didn't blow off and no jars broke during the process. So fingers crossed. All right, we're in luck. Everything looks good and intact. So I'm going to actually leave this as is. I'm not going to touch anything and just let it be overnight. As the jars cool, the buttons on top will depress, make that telltale ping sound, and hopefully everything will seal up. Anything that doesn't seal properly is going to end up in the freezer. So I'm going to let this be overnight and see how we are in the morning. The next morning, what I've done is I've removed the bands and I'm now examining the lid to make sure everything's sealed up nice and tight. Specifically, that center button in the middle of the lid should not have any flexibility or play to it. You shouldn't be able to get a pinging sound, and the lid should be joined tightly to the jar. All right, here is the result of 8 hours of work. 7 quarts jarred up with an additional quart in the fridge for Sunday night dinner. So that is 1 hour per quart. But as much work as it really is worth it, I think. We'll really enjoy these, over the fall and winter when tomatoes are but a memory. So that's it for today. Until next time, let's hope it all doesn't die.